Okay, so we've got some breaking news. Consent. We have the new guidance coming out from Working Party 29. So let's just go backwards a little bit. Working Party 29, they're the organisation which is an accumulation of all of the supervisory authorities around the EU. So they're sort of a committee, if you like, of all of the other experts and the people who are going to be enforcing the rules. In fact, the ICO sits as a very important part of Working Party 29. So our own data cops are part of it. The ICO has been waiting and not been producing guidance because, quite rightly, it decided that it should make sure that all of the EU was singing off the same hymn sheet and producing the same view, the same input and the same intentions and direction for people. We've now got that. That's what Working Party 29 have just released, the guidance on consent. And it says what it always says, to be honest, but there was some ambiguity about it, and certainly there was some wishful thinking about what that might or might not include. But basically it says that for consent to be deemed to be valid, then the data subject needs to have made a proper informed choice, and they need all the information available to them to be able to make that informed choice. It also says lots of other things, such as it must be freely given, it must be a positive affirmative action, and such like. But it's the information bit which is the important part here, because the guidance helpfully lists the minimum information that must be available to the data subject at the time they give consent. The first thing is, they must provide the controller's identity, so the name of the controller, the purpose of what the processing is about, what the data will be, as in what's being collected and what it's going to be used for, the fact that they have the right to withdraw consent, and information about any automated processing that might be intended, sort of decision making going on, and finally, if the consent specifically related to exporting the data to other territories, about where and about what steps were being taken to make sure that that became a secure and a safe thing to do. Additionally though, throughout it, it talks about where the data is going to be used by another controller. So this is where the information might be taken from one controller and given to another. And specifically for Corpdata's purposes, we're in the business of providing data to help people do marketing. And in the process of doing that, clearly we're in the business of giving the data to another controller. It does say then, for consent, that those other controllers would have to have been named at the time the consent was being gathered. It's quite an important thing. I hope that, amongst other things, what this does is encourages the DMA to finally fix the advice that they've got in their checklist, because the advice still says something rather nonsense along the lines of make sure that the consent you're hoping to rely on is adequate, something to that effect, when in fact that's a virtual impossibility, because the process of moving consent to somebody involved the consent being valid in the first place. The only way that could be done is if the data subject knew who was going to be using the data. And in the context of a third-party list, clearly you don't necessarily know who's going to be the eventual user of it. So I don't actually think that's going to be that helpful, and I don't think it's very helpful advice, so I hope that gets updated, because it's currently just adding to the confusion. So, the only way to use it in that context would not be on the basis of consent, it would be on the basis of legitimate interest. This is where you're talking about renting a list from a third-party data company like Corpdata. It would be on the basis of legitimate interest, which indeed is what Corpdata has been preaching and changing all of our processes and procedures for quite some time now. It has to be legitimate interest from the point it's gathered right the way to the time it's eventually used. You can't pretend that it's consent at some point and then chop and change, because at the time it's being gathered, you have to have told the data subject why, how, what the legal basis was, and all of those things. You can't suggest that it's consent here, you're getting their consent, and then later change it to the basis of legitimate interest. You definitely can't hoodwink people. So you can't give people the impression that there's some ulterior benefit that they will get by giving you the data, or by giving you the consent, or even by giving you the information upon which you then use legitimate interest. You can't be hoodwinking them. So you shouldn't be trying to suggest that in actual fact, in getting the data, you will in any way, shape or form help them have a better search ranking, let's say, on the internet, or help them get a better risk score in terms of credit risk worthiness and things like that. You can't connect it to getting some other benefit, such as, if you give me your data, you can download the white paper. Those things are all separate from the eventual marketing use of the data, and they need to be seen as separate by the data subject at the outset. If they're not, then they were kind of coerced to give their data, and that's not fair. Additionally, I'd say if your data provider, the organisation supplying you data has at any stage talked to you about the fact that they're getting all the consent that's going to be needed to be compliant, you should be thinking really hard now, because the process they were using when they were gaining that consent clearly isn't the same as the process they should have been using if they were gaining it on the basis of legitimate interest. So a little bit of a double shuffle now, just to decide that they're going to use a different basis after all, is too little, too late, and it doesn't alter the fact that the data was gathered in an unfair way in the first instance. So I certainly would be asking anybody who's ever talked to you about how their list is going to be appropriate and fair on the basis of consent, how they're going to transition that. I would suggest to you they probably need to bin most of their data, or at least not supply it until they've gone back through the entire research programme and brought it up to date properly with a legitimate interest basis. Don't forget, from your point of view, you might think that's their problem and their fault, but GDPR requires you to prove that you are in no way responsible, and that involves you having done these checks to make sure that the data was fit for purpose and available for you to use properly and compliantly. So, all the very best. If you do need data that will allow you to work on the basis of legitimate interest happily, by all means you can come through to Corpdata. We'd be delighted to talk to you. If you have any specific questions about GDPR, we also have a number of people, myself included, who would be more than happy to try and talk to you there as well. So, all the best. There's some consent guidance. Thank you very much. Working Party 29.